I'm on the road again to talk with someone from an underrepresented or marginalised group so that I can better understand what their life is like. In this episode, that person is writer, singer, broadcaster and author Carrie Marshall, and as always, we're going to meet in a place which has happy associations for her so that she feels safe and joyous as she shares her story with us. And today that place is the Icebox, jammed under an arch in the Gorbals on the south side of Glasgow. It looks like a charity shop when you arrive, with books and DVDs piled high, and it is. But go through that shop and you pop out into the high-vaulted chamber of a music venue, and it's this space that Carrie has brought us to. Carrie is a trans woman, and she's written a book called Carrie Kills a Man, due out in November 2022, about her experience of coming out and transitioning later in life. I start by asking Carrie what words, what language I should use in talking about her, and I ask her to challenge me as we talk if, however unintentionally, my language gets disrespectful.
I will do. Just she, her. I'm a trans woman.
Trans woman, but with a space very clearly between.
Very, very important.
Why is that so important?
Because if you jam them together, it implies that we are somehow other and not real. Like, for example, you wouldn't talk about a gay boy with no space between the two.
You might.
Well, if you were meaning it as a slur.
Yes.
But it's the connotations of it. It suggests that we're not being taken seriously, that there was some sort of question about the validity of who we say that we are.
And so that space then is talking about the fact that trans is an adjective.
Yes.
To describe the kind of woman you are.
Yes.
You're a middle-aged woman.
Middle-aged woman, fat woman, Scottish woman, all of these things. And I think it's important that we look at it that way, because we don't all have the same experience. We don't all come from the same background. There are physical differences, there are mental differences, all this kind of stuff. But we are all part of the same tribe, and in many cases have the same common enemies. And so I kind of think it's important to have that qualifier. And
so the first thing you said was about pronouns. And I guess we should have a bit of a conversation about pronouns, because that's one of the things that's been... I hesitate to say weaponised, although it's true, but it's one of the things that has been most toxic, I think, in the conversation around trans and non-binary people. You did identify as non-binary at one point, didn't you?
I did
so
at first.
So talk a bit about that as well.
I came out about 5 years ago and went from being apparently a cisgender man to being what I believed was non-binary. And the reason for that is that's how I understood it at the time, but I had never moved through the world as anything other than a cisgender man. And it turned out, as I started to move through the world as a non-binary person, I sort of discovered that I was actually quite binary after all, just not the one that everybody had thought that I was.
Including you.
Including me. And I remember posting to a trans forum, I just basically went, oh my God, I'm trans. And like properly trans. And I need to be careful with my language here, because I'm not implying there's a type of trans that is not proper. But I thought I was somewhere in the middle, and I realized over a period of months that I wasn't comfortable like that, I was much, much happier being in the other box than the one I started off in, rather than trying to be in between them.
And so we've talked about the sort of language that you like to be used in referring to you. What sort of language is problematic? What's offensive?
I don't take offence easily. And
what's hurtful then?
Yeah. A good example, I was out for a very, very fancy dinner with my best friend recently. And I had been spending a lot of time, particularly through lockdown and all the rest of it, basically just looking like a potato, you know? So I wasn't putting any effort in.
Gender equals potato.
Yeah, my gender was a potato. And it's like, you know, because if you don't have to go out and make an effort, you just don't. I mean, you're not going to sit about, I'm not going to sit about an underwear brand, 7-inch heels or whatever, when I'm just putting the bins out. So I made an effort, and, you know, I'd done my makeup, and, my wig was looking nice, and I put on nice clothes and all the rest of it. We had a lovely time, lovely meal. And then at the end, when I paid my bit of the bill, I was called sir. And it's not that I was offended, but it was just like, did you have to do that? You know? It's like I'm a dog owner, and, you know, I will occasionally say, oh, he's a good boy, and they'll say, actually, she's a good girl. Oh, right, okay. And I know that if I continue to do that wrong, they'll set the dog on me. Whereas there's this, sometimes there is a deliberate misgendering of people. And when it's done accidentally, it's not so much, it's not that you're a snowflake. It's not like that one person misgendered me and I'm going to go, ah. But it's like I went on air once and I was misgendered like a dozen times in the space of 1.5 minutes, having already been misgendered by a whole bunch of people before I went into that studio and on the phone before I'd even left my flat. So it's like Chinese water torture to an extent where it's just like boom, 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 because there's an element where I know what I look like. I know that I was not born as a cisgender woman. I know that there's only so much that I can do with makeup and a wig and getting stubble pulled out my face and all this kind of stuff.
Because you came out quite late in
life. Late in life, I didn't come out until I was in my mid-40s. So,
and so let me finish your point. Sorry, Carrie.
No, go ahead.
So it's important then, I think, we perhaps talk about, you, I think, would talk about the fact that you've always been trans.
Yes.
But you didn't come out earlier. Why?
Because I didn't know. I didn't know that people like me existed. And, hopefully this is something that young people are not going through now, because there is so much more visibility, there's so much more information out there. But to the best of my knowledge, when I was growing up, there were two types of T people, right? There were transsexuals who were transitioning from male to female, would have the surgery and would then marry a man. And there were transvestites, which were the ones that didn't want the surgery but liked the clothes. And they were perverts. It was all in the press at the time, and we talked about this at school, that cross-dressing was something that people did for comedy on television. So I knew that I didn't want to be with a man because I'm attracted to women. So I couldn't be transsexual. And I didn't realize there was such a thing as trans people who weren't straight. And it turns out, I know now that like 70% of us are as gay as biscuits, right? Or bisexual or asexual or demisexual or polyamorous or whatever it happens to be. Queer, yeah. That's probably the best word for it. But that was just a possibility that I did not know was there. And there's, it's a cliche, we cannot be what we cannot see. But it's true, because you spend all these years and the slightest sign that you are different, you kind of clamp down on it, because you don't want to be one of those weirdos that they talk about on the TV. You don't want to bring shame on your family and all that. So yeah, I didn't really put it together until my mid-40s, after a fairly prolonged period of very severe depression. And what I realized was the depression was a symptom rather than a thing in itself. And the reason that I was so sad is because I was feeling really, really trapped. And it basically came to a fairly stark choice, because I was at the point where there was a little voice in my head telling me to kill myself all of the time. And it was getting very, very persuasive. And I had reached the point where I was actually making concrete plans to do it. And I had a word with myself, and I tried to read a lot of stuff to try and stop from being sad. And there was a light bulb moment for me, which was I was reading a book called Happy by Derren Brown. And he says in it that if you've got something to come out about, you should come out. Because if you don't, you're viewing the whole of your existence through the prism of the secret that you're trying to keep. You're convinced that everybody else is trying to find your secret, that you have to do everything in your power to stop people finding out. And it turns out most people couldn't care less. And when you understand that, he described it as like you're carrying this heavy bag of rocks around with you. And when you put the bag of rocks down, it's just like, whoa, you mean this is what normal people feel like? And that was what coming out felt like for me. It's like, oh God, this is what normal people feel like. And after 40-something years of not feeling normal, of feeling that I was broken in some way, to suddenly be in a situation where it's not me. I'm fine. It's maybe the slight hormonal imbalance needs to be sorted out, but other than that, we're good.
So we talk about the joy you felt at that point, and let's talk about the space we're in now.
Yes.
Why are we here today?
We're here. This is the Icebox Arts and Music Centre in the Gorbals in Glasgow, which is previously famous for the Gorbals vampire of childhood legend. This is the first place that I stood on a stage wearing a dress as a comfortably out trans woman. I had been in bands for years and years and years, and I stopped about 15 years ago to have kids. And just, life stops you doing all that kind of teenage stuff. And I really missed it. And then I thought, shortly after I came out, it's like, I think really what the world needs is an enormous middle-aged transsexual women playing guitar. But there was something really freeing about it, because I forgot I was trans when I was on stage, right? The whole day I was like, I'm going to go to this open mic night, I'm going to do a couple of good songs, and I'm going to wear a dress. And, I'm going to weaponize my fear almost. It's like a kind of passive-aggressive thing. It's like, I'm really scared, so I'm going to be quite aggressively trans. Look at me, I'm trans. And I got up and I played, and I just had such a great time. And it's like, people were really getting into the music. It was a really nice crowd. The people here are really lovely. And it was a really diverse crowd as well. And I forgot I was trans. I just was having such a nice time on stage. And I got talking to loads of people afterwards. So I've sort of got a second home here ever since, like, my band rehearses here. We're playing here fairly soon. And I think one of the things I like about it, there's a lot of stuff about the negativity that is surrounding trans and gender non-conforming people at the moment. That's not my experience in the real world. I mean, there's roasters out there, but generally my experience is very, very positive and very joyous. And this is kind of symptomatic of that, because this is absolutely a safe space for people who are different in any way. And yeah, so that was the beginning of something really quite great, to the point, like, it's difficult to explain this, right? I used to be terrified that if anybody found out that I was even slightly feminine, they'd, run me out of town with pitchforks and flaming torches and stuff. And, in the summer here, I'm going to go down, I'm going to play the Sparkle Festival, which is a big trans festival in Manchester. And I'm going to be on the stage going, look at this trans person here. And I'm going to play some songs, and I'm going to jump about. It's like, I was speaking to you earlier, I played a gig on Saturday night. There were some trans and queer kids in the audience, and they were really getting into it. And that's, like I said to you, I felt like Bono, but not like in the horrendous kind of way. But it was like that, that connection thing.
And they saw themselves in you.
Yeah. And I think that's important, because, it's not that I'm cool in any sense of the word, but, it's all about possibility. And like my kids' generation, they're used to the idea of trans people just doing stuff, not being like a sinister bogeyman somewhere, but just going out there.
Well, on that point, let me ask you, when you were on the stage out as trans performing, you were wearing a dress.
Yes.
Why are you not wearing a dress today, Carrie?
Because I've put on quite a lot of weight since then. I am sort of going through a bit of a fat phase at the moment. The main reason is I don't feel the need to try so hard. When I first came out, I'd learned very, very quickly that the more feminine I appeared, the less attention I would attract. I mean, everybody looks, but not in a sort of scathing way. Because if people can classify you, I think they just sort of mentally do that and move on. And at that point, I hadn't been on hormones. I hadn't legally changed my name. I didn't have a gender recognition certificate. So I kind of felt that I had to be quite traditionally, stereotypically feminine to be taken seriously. And part of that, as you're going through, it's what they call the real life experience, what the gender clinics make you do, and you have to get a gender recognition certificate, where you have to live your life fully female, and any suggestion that you're not means you can't get a gender recognition certificate. So there was an element of that. Whereas now, I'm still trans if I'm wearing a bin bag. I'm legally female. I've been on hormones for 4 years, and all that kind of stuff. And I think part of it as well, I'm not 16, right? I know this is come as a shock, but when you first come out and you've just suddenly got this world of possibilities, it's often compared to being a teenager, where you're just like, here's all these things and all these fashion mistakes that I need to make now. But you're not 16 anymore. You're in your mid 40s. You're big shouldered and all that kind of stuff. And I was dressing for the person that I wished I was, rather than the person I am. Whereas now, it's more about, I dress to do things now, rather than to be things. So I'm reasonably tidy today, because I was seeing you, and I was doing the BBC earlier on. Tomorrow, I'll be just dawdling about the flat, and I'll be putting the bins out and walking the dogs. So there'll be no makeup, no wig, that kind of stuff. But then it was very much about, almost like fake it till you make it, almost. And And I think it was necessary because it means you're running the gauntlet of quite a lot of stuff very, very early on. The taxi driver who doesn't believe you are, the app says you are, the people talking about you in the pub, the guy shouting at you in the street, all this kind of stuff. I went through all of that very, very quickly when I first came out and was presenting very, very female. And, like going to gigs, like 12,000 people at a gig, and I'm going to get a frock on for that as well. And I know I don't feel the need to do that anymore because I'm much more settled and comfortable, I think.
So let's take you then to a place where you're not comfortable. Talk to us about times where you felt unwelcome or excluded or worse, I guess. It might be a big thing, a small thing, maybe yesterday, might have been 5 years ago.
I haven't felt it much in the real world. I've been yelled at and things like that.
And do you get a sense about whether you get more abuse than a cisgender woman would get? Or is this the base level of abuse that all women get?
That's a really good question. I tend not to travel in places where I think I'm going to be singled out. So, for example...
But I suspect that's a similar experience that a lot of cisgender women would have as well.
Yeah, so, it's really, really interesting having played for one team and now you're playing for the other team in the way that people look at you. And, there's a good example. I was in the pub, which has always been my safe space. It's the first place I presented feminine. And a guy came up to me and put his arm around me and his head was right here and he wanted me to put my phone down and have a chat. And I told him to get lost and he didn't go. And it's like, that's the point where you're supposed to go now because I've said I don't want to talk to you. And he wouldn't go. And it was only when my faintly frightening friend came over and told him to sling his hook that he finally went. And I've never felt that powerless, because, I'm 6'1", I've got, I'm more rugby player than ballet dancer. And if I want to put on my scary voice, I can usually get people to leave me alone. Nope. And it's that thing of you're suddenly seen as lesser, as a thing rather than a person. And this is not new to any cisgender women, but it was a real eye opener for me because one of the things that I didn't realize, and I can't remember who it was that came up with this analogy, but I was playing, if life is a video game, I was playing it on easy mode. And I just assumed that it was easy for everybody. It's not, it's really not. It is if you're straight, white, middle class, well-educated, decent parents, decent, salary, decent job, It's not for the vast majority of people. And that's something that's really important. There's a thing going around at the moment, this idea that trans women are all affluent, educated, middle class and white. And it's like, no, that's because that's the sort of people that get on television. They tend to be affluent, educated, middle class and white. The vast majority of trans people are not. And this is something that, like, for example, in my book, I've tried to mention a few times, which is like, I am not representative of the vast majority of trans people. The vast majority of trans people have got a much harder deal than I have. And a vast majority of women of any type have got a much harder deal than I have. But I've got a position where I can come on in front of a camera and talk about it, or I can put a book out and talk about it. So I've got a position that I can use, hopefully, to move the dial just a little bit, I guess.
And has that dial moved? Think back to you at 12, let's see. How do you think society is better or worse, and possibly both?
It's both.
Dealing with trans people now?
It's both. I think what's changed is trans people used to be the butt of the joke and only the butt of the joke.
Give me some examples.
I used to watch Kenny Everett, and he had a character called Cupid Stunt, who was a bearded socialite in a miniskirt, and he would constantly cross her legs. And pretty much every male comedian would dress up in drag for laughs. And that was about as far as it went. Now, I obviously wasn't out as a trans adult back then, so I don't know what the experiences were for trans women. What I know of the medical system and the other barriers that they had a much, much worse time than I do. But just in terms of the popular culture wasn't vicious. And I think that has changed. So
why do you think that's happened?
I think there's a number of things that have happened. I think one of the most significant things that's happened is just increased visibility. So we had the famous transgender tipping point, where all of a sudden it wasn't like Little Britain, I'm a lady caricatures. It was like Laverne Cox. who's just an astonishing actor. And all of these other people in the public eye. We had the Wachowski sisters who did The Matrix. Monroe Bergdorf and Juno Dawson and Paris Lees and all these just incredible people who were not apologetic. There wasn't like, I'm sorry, I'm transgender. No, it's like, no, I deserve a seat at the table here. So I think inevitably when that happens, there's a backlash. I think as well, one of the things that's quite significant that happened is the equal marriage came in at roughly the same time in Britain and in America, and the religious right in particular decided to refocus. And this isn't a conspiracy theory. They put it in writing on their websites. I can give you the links to it. And they basically said, right, we're going to go after the trans vote now. Because it's difficult to go up against gay and lesbian people now, because so many of us know gay and lesbian people and know that they're just like everybody else. But trans people are a much, much smaller group. So I think, if we went to war with the brownies, we would be outnumbered by the brownies. There's maybe 300 to 500,000 of us in Britain. Something like between 0.4 and 1% of the population. There was not many of us. So you can absolutely tell stories about trans people as monsters, because a lot of people don't think they know a trans person. And if you think all the people that knew me until I was 45 didn't think they knew a trans person.
And you always were.
And I always was, but I wasn't out because the culture hadn't changed to a point. Without the transgender tipping point, I don't think I would have understood.
It's worth mentioning there as well as a famous chart, which is often brought out in this conversation, and it's about left-handedness in the US, which shows a dramatic, sharp rise in the number of people identifying as left-handed. That's the wrong way of saying it, but who say they're left-handed.
Yes.
And then it hits a plateau because there's only ever a natural level there. And so much the hysteria around this conversation about trans people, but there's the same hysteria around gay, lesbian, bi people, and it will be the same bogeyman that's invented 20 years hence when that dialogue is about this massive rise. And you talk about the transgender tipping point. The reason I bring up that chart is that is both a brilliant and empowering thing for people like you, but it's also a thing that gets weaponized against people like you, because a lot of people will say, trans people are taking over.
Yes. I think it's really interesting. And I love that chart, because I've remembered the numbers that until we stopped beating people for being left-handed, the number of people who said they were left-handed was about 2%. As soon as we actually started paying attention and not forcing them to be right-handed, not forcing them to use right-handed machinery, not forcing them to lose limbs in accidents because the factory equipment wasn't set up for left-handed people, it went to 11%. And it has stayed that ever since, because that's the number of people that are left-handed. They talk about people like going to clinics in England. It's still like a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent that are going to this. So what we're seeing is not a sudden rise in people deciding to be trans, but we're seeing a dramatic increase in people not being scared anymore. So I was trans when I was 6.
And you were still scared, let's be. Yeah. And to this day, in some senses, are still scared.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. But the fear of coming out has diminished to the point. Like my eldest has got a wide range of LGBT plus friends. It's just not a thing as far as they're concerned. Being trans is one of the least interesting things that you can be as far as they're concerned. It's just a thing. It's like you might as well go on about being a redhead.
And that brings us back to that point at the start where you are a trans woman. Yeah. It's just one facet of your identity as a woman, as a person.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would love to post on social media about just stupid stuff all the time, but I don't tend to. Because there's so much negativity going on at the moment. And I think that I have got quite a lot of people who follow me that wouldn't necessarily be following other trans people. So at the risk of boring them to death, I think it's important to try and expose that. But I think coming back to this place, what this place demonstrates is that what you see on the internet and what's in the papers is not real. It's a very, very small group of very vocal roasters. But that's not what most people are like. I mean, last night I was at a Pet Shop Boys gig at the Hydro, and I became big pals with Doris, who's in her 60s, was there with her husband, and was not remotely fazed by me at all, because we were just there to enjoy a gig. That's what most people are like. Most people don't care. It's not the most interesting thing about you. What's more interesting is, have you seen them before? What do you think of that song? You're going to be out dancing. That's what people care about. And that's where we aren't in terms of the wider culture. And I think it serves a lot of agendas. There's an awful lot of people paying their mortgages, punching down on trans people at the moment. And there are, very, very strong links between this and QAnon and the incel movement and anti-abortion. There's an awful lot of the same organizations that are involved in this. So it does feel a bit frustrating to go on the internet or open a newspaper at the moment and see such a distortion of what the reality is for the vast majority of us.
Well, let's cheers us up a bit then. Can you talk about a time where you've seen basically somebody in a position of authority, might be a boss, might be an employer, might be an organisation, where they've demonstrated genuine leadership and they've actually been practically of use to somebody who's trans?
I can think of quite a few. Probably the best one I can think of is Apple. I do copywriting, among other things, for a living. And I've been writing for Apple for a good few years now. They've always known I was trans. The person that hired me knows me personally from before. And it's never been a thing. And last year for Pride Month, they set out to commission LGBT plus people to write about LGBT plus people and then put it on apple.com. So this is like millions of people get to see this. And I did this interview with a video game developer who had written this beautiful, beautiful app. I wish I could remember the name of it now. It's about a young trans girl coming back to her hometown, having started transition. And it's wonderful. It's like really creative and inventive and all the rest of it. And the developer's an absolute firework of a human being as well. And it was just like, I'm getting paid really well because Apple is not poor to talk to this really awesome trans person about a really awesome bit of trans media because I'm trans. It's like, this is good. This is the sort of future that I want. But even on a more a local level, there's an organization called Scottish Women Inventing Music, and they are all about trying to get better representation of women and non-binary people and marginalised groups into the music business, which is traditionally very pale, male and stale. And they invited me to their launch, and I wasn't going to go because I didn't feel welcome. I had never been to like an all-women event before, and they're like, come, you need to come. And right up until I walked in the door, I wasn't going to go. I was terrified. I mean,
and what were you scared of?
There was a journalism organization for women who, like literally the day before, some of their most high-profile people had been doing some really transphobic stuff and making it very, very clear that their definition of women did not include women like me. And I felt that would be the case as well with anything involving the music industry, because the creative sector is quite small and there's quite a lot of overlap. And
sorry to press you, specifically what would that look like? What were you afraid would happen when you walked through the doors? If you weren't welcome in that space, what would happen?
Somebody making a fuss and me being thrown out was what I expected. And in the end, I mean, as stories go, this is a really silly one, but in the end, it turned out to be useful because I was able to reach over the partition in the ladies' toilet and pass over a toilet roll to the woman in the cubicle next to me who was having a crisis.
Tall women, we can add that to your list of adjectives.
Yeah, tall. I'm useful to have around for high shelves and things. But that was really good. And one of the things that I really liked about it is they were very, very clear that they consider trans women to be women and that we faced the same stuff and different stuff. And again, it was a diverse room, so it wasn't just middle-class white women here. You know, it was people of color, it was people with disabilities, it was queer people, it was trans people. And that's important because it's the things that people experience, particularly in the music business, apply to all of those groups in different ways sometimes. And it's still going on. So for example, Talia, the award-winning trans DJ, encountered transphobic abuse at her own gig in Edinburgh last week. You know, this is stuff that is still going on. And you know that these guys are doing exactly the same thing to cisgender women as well, and to women of color and to disabled women and all that. It's just this was the time they were caught by somebody with a bit of profile. And I think so this is a positive thing, I think, because it means we can be part of something bigger.
And so how does that conversation feel to you? Like, so I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of all trans people, non-binary people, gender non-conforming people, but And you might give it a different answer tomorrow. But right now, how does the conversation feel to you? Specifically this conversation, I guess, but the wider conversation that's happening in society about trans people. How does it feel like it's going?
I fear that we are losing to an extent. I think in the long term, the arc is always towards progress and basic humanity and decency. But there was an awful lot of people very invested in painting trans people and trans women specifically as a danger, as a problem to be solved. And it certainly...
Even the framing of this as the trans debate
yes,
is problematic.
And it's not a debate. It's basically one group of people constantly pushing lies. I mean, a great example of that is the idea that trans people are being rushed into surgery, and particularly children are being rushed into surgery. Children do not get gender confirmation surgery in Britain, full stop, ever.
And why are children a useful lever in this conversation?
Children are emotive subject, and every hate group in history has used what we think of the children. And this is one of the things that I find absolutely appalling, that the people that claim to be representing, for example, lesbian and gay people, have forgotten that when I was at school, we were told that they were coming for the kids by the same people in many cases, by the same newspapers. We had the idea of, quote, predacious lesbians who would be recruiting in their job as teachers, who would be following your daughters into toilets and somehow converting them to lesbianism through some unspecified mechanism. And, you know, it's as old as the hills. It's that this group is a danger to your women and children. And, you know, we've seen it again and again.
And that's particularly appealing to a patriarchal system of society.
Yes, absolutely. And again, because it's a group that you don't know. And this is why...
Or don't think you know.
You don't think you know, yeah. But it's quite effective, because this barrage of misinformation, and in many cases active disinformation, stops us from necessarily taking our seat at the table and stops you getting to know who we are. And, you know, I've kind of opted out of the trans debate because I got fed up just going on air with people who just would lie. And I would be given, you know, one opportunity to reply to one of their points, and they would make another 9 completely false points, and then we would be out of time. It's like, well, I'm not coming on with that, because they're telling me, you know, it's like the equivalent of, you know, when did you stop beating your wife? And, you know, I'm not going to go on and say, well, other people are more violent than me, because that's framing it as this is about violence. We're not violent, any more so than any other group. We're more likely to be the victims of discrimination. We're more likely to be the victims of the wage gap. We're more likely to be the victims of housing discrimination, employment discrimination, more likely to have be denied healthcare, all this kind of stuff. And all this shouting about how dangerous we are is getting in the way of that. So, for example, when I first went to the gender clinic, it took 11 months from referral to being seen, not to getting treatment, just for the very, very first meeting. It's now over 3 years. And in some parts of England, at current clearance rates, it's 26 years. So there are
26 years.
Let's and again,
that point
not for treatment. So if a cisgender woman needs, for example, hormone therapy, she can go to her GP. Right now, the GP will do a blood test. A week later, the blood tests come back. You get a prescription, and you're in the chemist that day.
And to be clear, you're not suggesting that that's not that's wrong.
No, absolutely. But we have been classified as mentally ill for a very, very long time, and some people still believe that we are, just as gay people used to be classified as mentally ill, and just as feminists used to be classified as mentally ill for daring to not want to do what their husband did. They were hysterical. And that was only like declassified in the literature in like the 1980s. It's insane, no pun intended. And because of that, we are treated differently than anybody else in healthcare. So if I want to change anything about my prescription, I can't go to my GP. I have to go to the gender clinic, because it's trans medicine. It's the same medicine that your mum is probably on, but for me, it's magic trans medicine that only the magic trans doctors can do.
And talk to me as well. I know one thing that angers, or at least frustrates a lot of trans people, is the fact that cisgender people, and we should have explained that term at the start, people who identify as the same gender that they were born as, cisgender people get gender-affirming surgery or treatment without batting an eyelid. And one of the best examples there is men who suffer from erectile dysfunction, for example, will gladly be given, what the hell's the drug called?
Viagra.
Thank you, Viagra, in order to play a part in affirming their gender role.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting that you choose that one, because that does sort of tie in with the patriarchal idea that sex is there purely for reproductive reasons, and that as long as you're producing babies, that you're doing the right thing.
So draw that line for us then between the struggle of the trans community and abortion, for example.
I think they come down to the same thing, which is the removal of bodily autonomy. It's other people getting to decide what you do and what role that you have. And it's almost as if you are assigned male at birth, so when the doctor slaps you in the bum and goes, "It's a boy," even if you later turn out like me, not got that wrong, that your job is to be a patriarchal figure, and you should not be allowed to change that.
And that's true for women as well.
And it's true for women.
Cisgender women are very often assigned the role of childbearing.
Yes, and it's the idea that like with the abortion thing, it's not a question of when a fetus becomes a human. It's when the mother stops, or the potential mother stops being a human. And it's this reduction of a woman down to her reproductive capability. And that is weaponized against us as well. Because we cannot possibly be real women because, we don't have a uterus, or we don't have a vagina, or we don't have breasts, or whatever it is. But the level of knowledge out there is horrific. I mean, I saw one woman claim that trans women don't have pelvises. I saw another one saying that trans women on HRT are not allowed by Stonewall to go in lifts. This is like, right, when you were at primary school, this guy, says that, if you kiss somebody standing up, you're going to have a baby. This is the level of biological knowledge that we are up against here sometimes. And it's like, one of the things that I found very interesting, again, by moving from the male gender to the female gender, is all of a sudden the doctors don't give a shit. Right? Previously, as a guy, go in, yeah, what do you want? What's wrong with you? Yeah, have all the drugs, have all the operations, have all the medicine you want. You go in now and it's just like, and my GP's really good, but even then the whole system is operating on the assumption that there's nothing really wrong with you and that you don't know best. And I had a situation with my gender clinic doctor who should bloody well know better. He messed up my prescription in a way that would have been really serious, and I spotted it. And when I complained about him, he put in writing that I was hysterical. It's like,
you've made it there. You've certainly embraced all the tropes of femininity at that point.
Yeah, I was horrified, but at the same time I felt slightly validated. And all my cisgender women can talk for days about the ill treatment they've had, but it's this idea that uniquely that women and trans people are not smart enough or wise enough to know about their own bodies and to accurately describe how they feel and who they are, what they're going through and what they need. And, for me, going on hormones changed my brain in terms of I'd always been like this sort of mental fog. And I don't have that anymore. And it's a bit like, like in The Wizard of Oz when it suddenly goes into Technicolor. It was like that. It was like, and the part of me is really angry about it because I could have had that when I was a teenager or in my 20s. I could have had that clarity. I could have seen those colors my whole life instead of waiting until I came to the point that I was basically going to do myself in. And then only because I didn't do that, I discovered, hang on a minute, the world is not black and white. And this is not necessarily the right route for everybody who's questioning their gender. And I think one of the problems that we have now is that it's becoming really, really entrenched in almost like a battle. We should be having a conversation about this and letting people have room to explore and to decide what fits for them and to change. So, for example, if somebody wants to try living in the other gender for a while and then decides it's not for them.
Or in no gender.
Or no gender. It's like... And it's really interesting when you start looking at it because it's like the number of things I had to change my ID on when I changed my legal sex or my legal gender. It's used interchangeably in British legislation. It's like, why do you need to know what genitals I have for me to drive a car? Or to have a bank account? Well, we know why, because until very recently, women weren't allowed to have credit cards or bank accounts. But it's like when you start going back about this, I do feel like a toddler sometimes. I'm just going, yeah, but why? Why do we do that? Why do I have to have this marker? Why do you need to know what shape my bits are in order for me to access this service or to get decent healthcare or to be taken seriously by my doctor? It shouldn't.
And the more you experience the healthcare system as a woman, the more you have become furious at the treatment of all women in the healthcare system.
Yes. I mean, I'm complaining about my year-long wait for the gender clinic. One of my friends had to wait like 8 years for a diagnosis of endometriosis. And this is not unusual because her doctor is a 60-year-old straight white guy who just goes about, oh, women's stuff, you know? And, you know, we are failing 51% of the population easily. And, you know, this is not in any way to malign the experiences of men or trans men. You know, they have a whole different range of stuff that they have to go through as well. It's just that I am now aware of so many things that I wasn't before. And, you know, I describe it in my book. It's like I didn't know that I had the golden ticket because I wasn't Black or South Asian, disabled, neurodivergent, visibly queer, anything like that. So I just sort of went through my nice wee world, and everything was great. And it's not great for most people. And it's like there's a thing that I really like because all trans women seem to be bass players in bands. There's this thing that seems to be a thing, and I saw a meme and it was like a trans woman who's just come out in her band, and it's like a song about being trans. And then like 2 years after coming out, all the songs about smashing capitalism and the patriarchy. That's kind of where I am now. It's like when I'm writing songs, it's all like kind of, because you become, you know, this terribly misused word woke, right? When I came out, I didn't know anything. And I know a lot more now. And I'm ashamed by how little I knew and how unaware I was. And
you'll probably know more tomorrow, right?
Yeah, always. Oh no, there's not a day that goes past that there isn't more. And you know, I'm sitting down, and one of the things that I've been doing is I'm trying to be a good feminist. I always considered that I was a feminist, and looking back, no, I wasn't. I thought I was in the way that cisgender guys think they are, but I wasn't. So I've been reading like tons and tons and tons of feminist stuff, and I'm amazed women don't riot. And I think it's because there's just too many things to be furious about. It's picking a reason to riot. That's the problem.
I haven't got time.
No, too busy.
I'm going to ask you our last question, which is, if I was to hand you a magical wand that could, in some way, not solve, but in some way radically improve diversity, inclusion, equity in society, what changes once you've waved that wand?
I think the single biggest thing would be to get people to step outside themselves and to try and walk in other people's shoes. I mean, I know it's a cliche, but the world is very, very different when you walk it in women's shoes. And it's very, very different if you're in a wheelchair. And I've found that certainly now my circle of friends is much more diverse than it was before. So my circle of friends before I came out was all guys. And my circle of friends now is women, trans women, non-binary people, neurodivergent people, autistic people, people with disabilities, all this kind of stuff. And I've learned an awful lot as a result of that. And, you know, fundamentally, they're my friends because they're really kick-ass people. But with having a more diverse friend group, that has made me much more aware of how it is for other people. So I think, and this is one of the reasons that I'm optimistic, because, you know, this genie is not going back in the bottle. You can be as nasty as you want to trans people, to queer people, to anybody else that you want, but we're not going anywhere because that knowledge is out there now. We've had the left-handed moment where we're not willing to put up with this anymore. We're not willing to put up with a healthcare system that is so horrifically biased against us. We're not willing to put up with people discriminating against us because they think we look a bit weird, or whatever their reasons happen to be. And I think we have a long way to go, I think. So there's still attitudes, for example, that people can't imagine why anybody would find a trans person attractive. And that's a cultural thing, and that has to change. But it's like, I think I used to feel that the world revolved around me because it did. And I think if we maybe understood that it doesn't, that other people are going through their own stuff, that they're all carrying their own bags of rocks around, I think we can become better people as a result of that. I'm not always that optimistic, but I do think that's where we're heading.
And that's a good note to end on. Carrie Marshall, thank you so much.
Thank you.